Good evening, ladies and gentlemen, and welcome back. I'm your host, InaneDragon. I promise, the inane explanation of homeopathy is still in the works. It just kind of grew into something I hope you'll all agree is better than any of my prior work. Now that that's out of the way, what fodder have we found for today? Well, YouTuber Jacob Pando has decided to enter the ring of Christian apologetics with a rather tall claim. Specifically, he's thrown down the gauntlet with a series of questions he asserts cannot be answered by any atheist without invoking God. However, he doesn't seem to realize that, every one of these questions has already been answered. Rather well, if you're being honest, and been answered for years in many cases. Science being what it is, the answers get better as the years go on and more information is collected, so it's always worth checking in on them. These questions break down into two separate videos, the first of which was more than adequately answered by Sir Sick and Godless Cranium. Links to their videos in the description box. So, in the name of brevity, I'll only tackle his second video where he reframes some of the questions and tries to get into a bit more detail. But there's a catch, Jacob, if you're watching. I'm afraid I have to admit that I fully believe I will be talking past you. I believe this based on your response to Sir Sick. Just to remind you, let's watch a clip or two.
Let's just get one thing straight. Saying I don't know is not an actual answer to any of the questions I am posed. Simply because you don't know the answer doesn't mean there isn't an answer.
So, I might be a little bit angry in what I have to say next. Deal with it, as that's a consequence of saying something as intellectually dishonest, morally bankrupt, vacuous, arrogant, and asinine as what you just said. When the literal, hard truth of the matter is that we do not yet know a specific answer, we don't know is the only answer that you can honestly give. To say, we don't have an answer for these questions, therefore I'm going to make something the fuck up, is to lie. To dismiss an honest expression of ignorance and assert that your unsupported claim is therefore true is to commit the classic argument of ignorance known as the God of the gaps. Nobody is claiming that there isn't an answer. They are simply admitting that we do not yet have the answer. And if we used your logic of making up an answer instead of investigating, we'd still live in fucking huts, starving and hiding from the predators lying in wait beyond the light of our campfire. Everything we have in life we owe to people who could humble themselves enough to admit that they didn't know. Because those jackasses kept asking the questions and looking for the answers. They went out from around the campfire and found food. They found water, whereas your intellectual predecessors sat their asses around the fire and claimed they could bring the rain by dancing, and a successful hunt would be accomplished because you'd sung the ancient songs of your people. Do you want theists? Because this is how you get fucking theists.
Secondly, simply talking as if you know what you're talking about doesn't make you right. Just saying because you almost had me convinced that you knew what you were talking about.
Well, you know what? At least he was able to talk as though he knew what he was talking about. You just repeat what sounded like the standard list of failed apologetics straight off of Answers in Genesis. There was no attempt to introduce original thoughts or ideas of your own, as every question you're asking has been put forward by far more convincing apologists than yourself. Of course, they were also slapped down by people who actually know what they're talking about, but that's beside the point. Today, you're just talking to me. Now that we've explained why I believe there's no hope that you'll listen, let me explain to the audience why I'm making this video anyways. I'm making it for those who are honestly looking for answers, and for those who have heard these questions before and perhaps thought, maybe there is something to this, but haven't come across the works of Lawrence Krauss, Neil Shubin, Richard Dawkins, Christopher Hitchens, and all of the rest of those far greater minds of which I can only hope to be a pale imitation. But what I will not do is pretend that you, Jacob, will ever actually listen to me. You've made it perfectly clear in your videos that you aren't interested in considering an alternative to your presuppositions, and anyone watching is free to check your videos, all linked in the description, to decide for themselves if I'm misrepresenting you. But please, people, don't go there just to shit-talk Jacob. I have no interest in seeing him driven off YouTube or even given a hard time. Who knows? Maybe I'm genuinely wrong about him and he will listen. Maybe getting a bit of a chewing out for his dishonesty will help him consider whether or not he's being honest with himself. So if you do comment on Jacob's videos, argue the claims, the facts, and the logic. Do not go to mock, insult, or harass. That will accomplish nothing productive. Now that I have poisoned the well, so to speak, let's watch his latest addendum to this saga. Questions that can't be answered by atheists.
Hello YouTube. If you're watching this video, you might have seen my other video where I impose 8 questions to the atheists. Questions I know for a fact that can't be answered objectively or with any objective criteria.
Insert standard mockery for recording vertical on a platform optimized for horizontal after repeatedly demonstrating that you can make horizontal videos with ease. More importantly, I have to call you out. You see, my dear audience, Jacob's response to Sir Sick came out the day before this video, so he was already aware of at least someone's answers. He just didn't like them. I reiterate, Jacob, the problem isn't with the answers, it's with your hubris and blind dedication to your presuppositions. If you were more honest, you'd recognize that the questions you're about to ask are reformulations of the questions Sir Sick answered. This is just an attempt to evade his answers. They aren't more questions, they're the same ones, asked differently.
So let me go ahead and add these new questions. These questions will add context to the other questions and will make it more sophisticated to answer because these questions are more detailed. These questions can't be pushed aside or you can't go off topic to answer these questions because these questions are asked in a very complicated way. These questions have several questions within them, which all relate to the core question, and I do this for 2 reasons. One reason is because I don't want to read 100 questions at one time, like question 1, question 2, question 3. And the second reason is because I feel like most essay questions have several questions within them.
If the question is complex, then it suggests certain things that aren't mutually exclusive, but I'm not going to try to argue that all of them are true in your particular case, Jacob. The first possibility is that you don't actually understand what you're trying to ask. You've heard these questions from other apologists or read about them on the web and thought, hey, that's a killer argument. The fact that you even ask the same questions that have already been answered repeatedly is pretty damned telling that this is the case. The next possibility is that you're attempting to lead the witness, and in fact, I know you are, on the morality question because the question itself presupposes the answer. And finally, it may be that you're simply trying to overwhelm the respondent in a form of verbal diarrhea known as a gish gallop. As I said earlier, these questions aren't going to add context. They're the same questions, reformulated and muddled up. Everyone watching should feel free to watch his original 8 questions video to see if they agree with this conclusion of mine. As to your reasons for calling a bunch of questions a single question, well, the first is called being lazy. I'd recommend calling them arguments instead of questions if that's the case. It's just lazy, but it keeps you from conflating a group of 3 or 4 questions with asking a single question. And for comparing your questions to essay problems on a test, you're making a YouTube video, you aren't composing a test for a high school philosophy class. Enough poisoning the well again. Let's have the first question. Questions.
Question 1. If you take into account theories like the Big Bang or the multiverse, which tells us that from a singular point our universe began to expand, and thermodynamics, which tells us that all the energy in the universe has an end and therefore has a beginning, how do you explain a universe popping into existence out of a realm without energy or space-time? How do you expect us to believe that the universe just popped into existence after an eternity of nothing? Do you think something else exists beyond our perception of space-time?
Well, the first thing I have to say is you're not even wrong. To address the assertion at the end of the question, it depends on what ultimately shows itself to be the best model of physics. That is, what model comports best to the evidence. You've conceded that the multiverse is a potential explanation, which means you've conceded that something which is eternal and always existing other than God could be an answer. And that's what the multiverse is, a potential explanation of the cosmos beyond our local space-time. It's important to point out that the multiverse is more than just conjecture. Depending on which of several possible interpretations of the standard model of physics you choose, all of which so far comport equally well with the evidence we have, then a multiverse is a necessary conclusion. If we ever disproved a multiverse, these interpretations of the standard model of physics would also then be wrong. It's worth pointing out that there's a new formulation of the standard model which may comport with the observed evidence and show that the universe has always existed, even before the Big Bang. Highly speculative right now, but definitely interesting. I'd rather be out hunting that lion than sitting around the campfire saying it just ain't so. But the reality is, other than what we compute mathematically, what comes before the Big Bang is unknown, except that no cosmologist or physicist argues that nothing, as you intend the term, ever existed, because nothing by its definition cannot exist. Existence is a property of things, not things. Even the religious apologists don't think there was nothing, they think there was God. Enough of the cosmology portion, let's talk thermodynamics. The laws of thermodynamics actually requires that energy never ends. What we're talking about is that all the free energy in the universe, that is, energy with which we could do some kind of work, will decay to entropic energy, waste heat that cannot be used to do work. This is the whole heat death of the universe thing. That being said, this state of total chaos is pretty close to the only scientifically useful definition of nothing we can come up with, and it's one of the possible origin points of a universe. Quantum physics tells us that nothing, in the sense of empty space with no particles and no radiation, is inherently unstable and will inevitably produce something. So the end of the universe could lead to the beginning of the universe. And then we get to another fundamental logical fallacy. Your second question violates the logical law of non-contradiction. As you have defined nothing to mean without space or time, you have to go look up the definition of eternal. Eternal means a thing which exists for a seemingly infinite amount of time. Time is a property of eternity, therefore if a state of nothing as you've defined it were to exist, then it could not have been an eternity before the universe came to be. But, setting all of that aside, you have confused the burden of proof. When you claim that you know the answer is God, you have assumed the burden of disproving all possible alternative explanations. The burden is on you to show that the standard model of physics is wrong in its formulations that predict a multiverse, or the new idea that may support an eternal universe. You have to prove that a state of nothing did in fact predate the Big Bang, and that it did so in a manner that precludes quantum fluctuations from producing a universe, and that it did so in a manner which allowed the existence of your God to exist contemporaneously, so to speak, with nothingness. Further still, you have to demonstrate that there are no other conceivable explanations except that of a God, or produce positive evidence rather than negative evidence for the existence of God. Until you've done that, all of your work is ahead of you.
Question 2. Are moral principles objective? If they are, on what moral foundation do you use to base them on? And what makes your morals any more right than anyone else's? Do you think that all people within your society should share your similar values, ideas, and feelings of things, even though to a lot of people our lives are meaningless and purposeless? Just look at all the crimes that go on today. That's proof enough that most people don't share your values or your ideals. I mean, why not live however you want for the day? Why don't you live however you want now? Why not YOLO and break whatever rules it benefits so that it can benefit your life experience? Why worry about anyone else but your own people, or those people you care about? Why care about anybody else? Can you honestly say that killing an innocent human being, however, without reason, isn't objectively wrong? You just prefer for it not to be that way. You just prefer that someone doesn't get killed. It's just based on preference. You feel justified in what you do, and others feel the same in what they do. I mean, what justifies your belief in holding them liable for breaking your sense of morality? If something evil happens in another part of the world, does that affect you in any way, shape, or fashion? Surely all immoral acts are simply part of nature. And nature itself isn't subjective, isn't enough reason to give us any reason to value what is good.
Given how much you've prattled on, I cut your counterthrust regarding the theistic worldview out of this. Here's the first thing you have to understand before we even care about the question. Whether or not objective morals exist is irrelevant to whether or not God exists. You have to prove that morality is universal and objective prior to using it as an argument for God. So honestly, I could just walk past this one. However, I will endeavor to explain my own position. This isn't a factual, objective answer because we don't have one. And when I say we, I'm including you, Jacob. You don't have an objective answer either. You have a set of assertions that you blindly accepted from your pastor without any critical examination. Morality, in the broadest sense, is completely subjective. You make your moral rules and I make mine. We then argue about which of these moral rules will accomplish whatever subjective goals we happen to agree with. Or, if we can't even agree on basic goals, we form separate societies and try to kill each other. In essence, we behave exactly as humans have behaved for millennia. The evidence supports the notion that morality is purely what we define it to be, which makes it subjective. That being said, if we can agree on a moral foundation, then we can make objective statements about what is good and what is bad. Just like in a game of chess. We have a goal and a framework within which we play, and anyone who is aware of that framework and that goal can judge whether or not the moves we make are good moves or bad moves. It's completely arbitrary, and yet it's objective once we agree on a goal and a framework. I personally base my own foundation on a combination of reciprocal altruism and the assumption that everyone has to be treated as though they have a set of inalienable rights, the very same rights that I would grant to myself, which I must grant to others. I freely admit that these rights exist only as abstract concepts rather than concrete realities, and if you ever want to test whether or not your rights truly, genuinely exist, get on a flight to some third world hellhole and punch the biggest fucker you can find. I promise, your rights will be efficiently and irrevocably removed from you. Why do I consider this a worthy standard to live by? Because it's how I want to be treated, first and foremost, but also because societies built on these standards have repeatedly shown themselves to be reasonably stable bastions of civilization and have done more to advance the human race than any other culture on the face of the planet. I like not living in a hut, constantly worried that someone will decide to kill me or rob me, wondering what lies beyond the campfire's reach. And thanks to morals like my own, we now live in a society that is freer and wealthier than any in history, a society which can reach the motherfucking moon if it wants to. That's more than enough for me, and if it isn't enough for you, you're a sociopath, and no one should waste their time debating someone who needs a tyrant to keep him under control and acting like a man instead of a savage.
So, question 3. How do you explain free will? Do you believe we have free will? If you do, why? If you don't, why not? If we don't have free will, how are we able to judge others for their actions if they can't help it, since they don't have free will? How can we judge others for what they do in life if they just can't help it?
Here we have a problem of definitions. If you mean libertarian free will, that we in some sense have an entirely independent capacity to make decisions independent of our environment or genetics, the current mood we're in, and everything else which is part of a natural world, we blatantly don't. I can change your decision-making with a few glasses of vodka if you don't believe me. If you mean free will in the sense of treating the whole person as a free agent in the world, making decisions based on their own unique thinking, then in certain ways, seems like we do, insofar as any mental concept can be said to exist. Which is to say, while you are ultimately just a lot of molecules in motion, your behavior as a full unit is more easily explained and modeled by treating you like a thinking individual capable of rational decision-making. Why do we have free will in the sense I'm describing? Because that's how anything with enough complexity to start building heuristic models of the world around them and reacting accordingly is going to behave. Free will is a label we put on this behavior. When I hold you accountable and judge you, you respond in certain ways. Again, evidence against libertarian free will, since we can generally predict how you'll respond when I punch you. I've seen apologists use the example of, I can choose whether or not to pick up this glass. Well, yes, you can. But if you're thirsty and you don't pick up the glass, you'll become dehydrated and may die, so you pick up the glass. Did you have free will in that choice, since a simple chemical fact, the lack of water in your system, compelled the action? If you answered no, then nothing can ever have free will. If you answered yes, then there's no reason not to treat every action as that of a free agent possessing its own will. Whether that will is an emergent property of the interactions of chemicals in the brain or a gift of God is irrelevant to the question of possessing it.
Question 4. How did the original life form come to life, and why? Why are there rules and conditions that need to be met in order for life to exist? For example, there must be H2O, the right amount of gravity, the right amount of distance from the sun. Not only do you have to get each of these things right in order for there to be life, but all of these conditions need to happen at the same time. And there are hundreds of conditions that need to be accurate at the same time.
You're not going to like this one. How did the original life form come into being? We don't really know for certain. However, we've proven that RNA can form spontaneously if the right conditions are present. We know that such conditions may well have existed on Earth early in its history, and we know that RNA can develop into DNA. From there, it's small, easy, evolutionary steps to get to cells, cells to bodies, and bodies into our particular body. Why did RNA come into existence? Because if the current evidence is correct, then the laws of physics and chemistry stipulate that the chemical reactions that will form the first self-replicating molecules will inevitably take place whenever the necessary conditions are met. Why are there rules and conditions? Well, that's more a question for your side of the argument. You posit an all-powerful God. Why did he make life so fragile that it can't survive across all of Earth? Why didn't he make Mars habitable? Worse still, for your argument, those hundreds of conditions you're saying have to be met are mostly assumptions. Yes, we need H2O for life as we know it, but we don't know if life as we don't know it could exist without H2O. We don't have any good models for such a life, but we also don't have models that necessarily rule out such life. Even if we did, water is so abundant that it's hardly a restriction for the formation of life. We have ice moons orbiting Jupiter with liquid oceans that may support life today, for fuck's sake. You can repeat this down the line for every other condition you have listed. The fact is that with only one inhabited planet that we know of to look at, we can't really know which conditions we're seeing that are necessary for life versus which are merely convenient. These conditions correlate to our existence, and correlation alone is not sufficient to declare that you've proven causation. As a final point, even if you show that all of these conditions are necessary, that doesn't mean they have to happen all at the same time. They merely have to happen for the same planet and then persist, which most of them will. Once the Earth is formed where it did, at the size that it did, the odds of it not continuing to have the size and orbit that it has are vanishingly close to zero, so you can add water at any point thereafter. Ditto every other condition you care to name, and we don't know just yet how rare these conditions are in other solar systems. We're only now charting the planets around distant stars, but if we listened to you, we'd stop looking and huddle close to the campfire for another story from your holy book. I choose to step away from the comfort of the fire and find out what's really going bump in the night.
Question 5. What fossil record or evidence is there to show that our ancestors originated from the sea and looked like fish or lizard type creatures? And I'm not saying that our ancestors were fish or lizard creatures, because I know how you guys think. I'm saying that where's the evidence that our ancestors, our ancient ancestors, looked like fish, and maybe looked like lizards, or even came from the ocean?
Let me start by saying, if you are genuinely asking these questions instead of trying to pose them as a set of gotchas, buy any of the following books and fucking read them. The Greatest Show on Earth by Richard Dawkins will walk you through a mountain of evidence for evolution. Why Evolution is True by Jerry Coyne will walk you through a corroborating and sometimes overlapping mountain of evidence. But most specifically, for your question, read Your Inner Fish by Neil Shubin, because he tackles this exact question, and he was personally involved in discovering a decent portion of the fossil evidence showing our fish and our lizard ancestors. By the way, since you're convinced that people will try to get you for it, I'll go ahead and say it for you. We evolved from reptilian creatures that themselves evolved from fish. Look at Tiktaalik rosei and stare at what could easily be your grandma from 375 million years ago before you try and gotcha me back by saying that paleontologists never declare direct lines of descent. Sure, they don't. I agree. But just like we have so many kinds of dogs today, the point is that Tiktaalik belong to a set of species, one of which is almost certainly our direct ancestor. We know this because we can look at the homologous organs, the embryology, and the DNA. Even if we had not one single fossil, we've got plenty of evidence for common descent. Look at Tiktaalik's front fins. You can see the same bones that we have in our arm and hand. It's right there. The evidence is right there. Watching the development of embryos from many different species, you can see how some of the structures in each embryo shift into different places and form amazingly divergent structures, all from the same basic starting blocks. Everything around us screams to our cousinship with everything living about us. There is so much evidence I can't give you a complete answer in a single video. It is quite honestly overwhelming. That you can't see it is an issue of your presuppositions, not a flaw in the data.
And these questions are very difficult to answer, and I understand that. And you know, if you can't answer them, that's fine. But the whole point of these questions being asked is to prove that not everything can be answered, and that some of these answers are better answered with a God. Things make more sense if we assume that a God exists. So thanks for watching, and peace out, guys. God bless.
These questions are only difficult to answer if you demand that we make an answer with 100% conviction. At that point, the only way we could do so is to be like you. Not even wrong. That is, by making up some unfalsifiable fairy tale that explains away all of the mystery in this universe instead of going out and finding the answers. But short of making things up, we can instead answer them pretty damned well by laying out what we know to be the theories best supported by the evidence. Unfortunately, you don't like real answers. You're comforted by the stories you tell around the campfire instead of being awed by the truths lying in wait beyond the safety of its light. The mistake you're making is that thinking the absence of an answer allows you to posit your God. But even if the answer is, I don't know, you can't just add your God or your holy book and say, bam, answered. You have to provide positive evidence that your God exists, not just negative evidence that there are things for which we don't yet have an answer. I can easily say, you're right. We don't know how life began. Clearly, dimension-hopping Pepes jizzed into the ocean, seeding the waters with meme magic. It has exactly as much explanatory power as your hypothesis, and if you weren't already convinced about God, you'd see that it's just as rational. I swear, the next time I find one of these videos that trot out the same tired, answer-begging questions, I'm going to answer the questions the same way you do. By making shit up that has no basis in reality. You've given up your game here, by the way. You are assuming a God, you aren't proving one. And assumptions are worthless until you prove them correct through experimentation and verification. Ideally, with falsification. So you want me to believe in your God, provide me a falsifiable test of his existence, and provide predictions about future discoveries or events that can only be true if your God hypothesis is correct. Stop weaving a tale around the fire and go hunting for God. If you catch him, you'll be famous. If not, maybe you, like Dawkins, will catch something even greater. The next big scientific discovery to overturn our world. Until then, I'm InaneDragon, and stories aren't bad unless you use them to replace reality. Don't forget to subscribe for more inanity, bring your own theories into the comments below, and if you can spare the cash, I'm always looking for more patrons. My thanks go out to $5 a month patrons, AMoldyDonut, and Yakaru Dezaki. Links to everything are in the description. And if you really like what you're seeing, share the video around. When I hit 1,618 subscribers, I'll do something special. Maybe even a live stream with some game giveaways. Why 1,618, you ask? Well, I love math and science, and there's a very important number that flat earthers just hate. That starts with the digits 1618. If you can't work it out, I'll spoil the fun when we get that many subscribers. Good night, everyone.